Hi, I'm Andy from ROCOL, and in this video I'm going to teach you how to load a grease gun. We're going to talk about the pressure and the quantity of grease that can be dispensed, and the main different types of grease gun are going to be standard side lever, one-handed and battery operated. And the method of applying the grease into the grease gun is with a standard cartridge, a Lube Shuttle cartridge, and also from a bucket of grease. So, loading a standard grease cartridge into a one-handed grease gun. The very first step that we need to do is to pull back the spring loading in the grease gun. So we put the grease gun between our knees and then we'll pull the spring out. This is quite tight, so this will take a certain amount of pressure to pull the spring out. Being careful not to knock the deactivation pin, we then need to use two hands. One hand to hold the handle and the other hand to hold the body of the grease gun to unscrew the body. With the grease cartridge, there are two ends to the cartridge, and on the cartridge it will say insert this end. So we need to remove the cap from the insert this end first. You can see the grease inside. We then slide the grease cartridge into the body of the grease gun and remove the other cap, being careful to remove any excess grease from the cap. We can then screw the body of the grease gun back on. So the thing that many people forget to do at this point is to press the button and push the plunger all the way in. If you don't do that, then the spring can only go as far as the end stop, and therefore you'll never be able to dispense all of the grease from the cartridge. So now we've done that, the only final thing that we need to do, there is a spring, a non-return valve, and when you press it you'll just hear a small amount of air release. You need to do that to bleed the air out, because otherwise you'll end up with an air block, you won't be able to dispense the grease. You can now see that grease can now be dispensed from the grease gun. So we're now going to load a Lube Shuttle cartridge into a Lube Shuttle grease gun. So a Lube Shuttle cartridge is different to a standard grease cartridge in that there's a threaded connection at the top of the grease cartridge. So the easy way and the simple way to load a Lube Shuttle grease cartridge into a gun is to unscrew the cap, push your finger or thumb up the base of the cartridge. There's a follower plate in the inside of the cartridge, so you can also see the quantity of grease that's left in the cartridge. So you can see that there's grease now standing proud of the top of the cartridge, and very simply you insert the grease cartridge into the gun and screw it in. One of the things that you will realise with the ROCOL Lube Shuttle cartridge, we've put the name of the product, the name of the grease, and the NSF registration code and category all around and visible on the Lube Shuttle cartridge. So this is a fully auditable system for the food industry. And again, you can also see the quantity of grease that's left in the cartridge before you go and apply the grease. And this grease gun is now ready to use. Remember, whilst applying grease, if you only want to apply half a pump of grease, if you only do from the base, no grease will come out. You need to fully extend the handle of the grease gun to start dispensing grease. So to only get half a pump, fully open the grease gun handle and do half a pump from there. If you only do it from closed, no grease will come out. We're going to now talk through loading a standard grease gun from a bucket of grease. The very first step is now to pull the plunger out of the grease gun, making sure that the locking pin holds in place. We can now unscrew the barrel of the grease gun. It's easier when the lever is opened. We can lay the handle assembly to one side, and then we can see that there is nothing inside the grease gun, and the plunger is all the way to the bottom of the barrel. We'll now open the bucket of grease. So now you can see the contents of the grease. At this moment the grease is now exposed, so we need to be very careful that we don't add any contaminants into the grease. We now need to transfer grease from the bucket into the grease gun, so we need to do that in a clean and hygienic manner. So we need to make sure that we have a clean and hygienic spatula. So in this case we have a plastic clean spatula. So we're now going to transfer. We need to try and avoid adding air into the grease mixture. So we need to be as careful and as smooth as we possibly can. So now we've loaded the grease into the grease gun, we can now assemble the handle back onto the body of the grease gun. Again, making sure that the handle is open, you've got more leverage. So that's tight, so we can now close the handle. So we now need to depress the lever and push the handle all the way into the grease gun. If we don't do this, we'll never be able to dispense all of the contents of the grease out of the grease gun. You can hear now there was a bleed of air from the grease gun, and that's good, and we can just then depress the air bleed valve to make sure that there's no air left at the top of the grease as well. This will make sure we can now dispense the grease correctly first time. Fully open, we should start to be able to dispense grease. So this is a battery operated grease gun. The principle is exactly the same as a hand-operated grease gun. However, when you squeeze the trigger, the quantity of grease dispensed will be approximately the same as per hand-operated operation, but you will hear a difference in sound. For each change of sound for the battery-operated grease gun will give you the same quantity of grease as per the hand-operated grease gun. With regards to the pressure and quantity of grease that can be dispensed from a standard grease gun, the quantity of grease depends upon the density of the grease, but for each complete pump from a standard grease gun, you can obtain approximately 1.5 grams of grease for a complete pump of grease. The same would be said for a battery operated grease gun. For each click on the grease gun, you will get approximately 1.5 grams of grease dispensed. With regards to the pressure from the grease gun, a standard grease gun can generate approximately 5,000 psi pressure. That's approximately 350 bar. That's a dangerous amount of pressure, so whenever you're using a grease gun, you need to be very, very careful not to put your finger or hand or any piece of skin over the end of the grease gun when you dispense the grease. So, the best time to lubricate a bearing. This is because the grease enters the bearing raceway through 3 or 4 ports around the circumference of the bearing. If the grease is added whilst the bearing is running, then it is spread smoothly around the contact surfaces of the bearing. If the grease is added while the bearing is stationary, then you'll get lumps of grease inside the bearing, which will take time to spread around the bearing and will cause the rolling elements to skid and the whole bearing to vibrate until the lumps have been spread. The best method of applying grease to a push-fit grease nipple is always to keep it clean. Clean the grease, any residual grease or dirt away from the grease nipple before you apply the grease. Clean the adapter on the grease arm before you apply the grease. And then apply the adapter from the grease gun onto the grease nipple and apply the grease. Remembering always to fully open the handle on the grease gun and then start to apply. You'll feel a certain amount of back pressure on the handle, and that's perfectly normal. In an ideal world, you would feel if you couldn't push it down anymore, then the grease nipple is blocked or the bearing is dirty and full of grease already. Or if it pushes straight down, the likelihood is that there's a disconnection somewhere between the grease nipple and the bearing itself. When you finish the greasing, remove the grease gun, get your clean cloth and clean the grease nipple again. Keep it clean. So with a cap head or a tat head nozzle as they're commonly known, you will see that they're a flat surface with a non-return valve. The adapter has got a groove in it which fits over the grease nipple and it slides to engage. So before we do the lubrication, keep it clean. A clean rag to wipe away any oil or residue or contaminants, and also the same with the adapter as well. Make sure that that's clean before you apply it to ensure that no dirt or environmental contaminants get inside the bearing. To engage the adapter, place it over the grease nipple and pull it towards you. You'll feel it will lock. It will not lift away from the bearing at all. You then apply the grease by pulling the handle of the grease gun fully open and start applying. You can then remove the adapter and you'll see that there's grease around the grease nipple. Clean that off to make sure that the contamination and risk of environmental contamination is reduced, and then clean the adapter also.